The Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, or DWR, shared this unique footage from their summer aerial fish dumps, a practice that restocks over 200 of Utah's high-altitude mountain lakes per year. Planes zoom just above the tree line, carrying hundreds of pounds of water and up to 70 pounds of fish. They drop about 35,000 fish in a single flight. It may be a shocking sight at first, watching trout and splake and grayling blast out of the back of an airplane, but it actually serves a practical purpose.
So this is the dramatic way that the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources adds fish to their lakes that aren't otherwise easily reachable. And they do this to get the fish population up in order to get the ecosystem in a healthy place where everything can thrive and people can fish and things like that. Today we're going to be looking at how these types of animals can be affected by their environment of things that are non-living, and we're going to look at how the type of water affects which type of fish can live where.
In yesterday's lesson, we talked about the different characteristics of streams that affect the water quality and how much dissolved oxygen is found in a stream, which affects the biodiversity of life. So we know that streams are a part of watersheds, right? So now we're going to talk about how these different factors and different bodies of water that make up watersheds interact with each other.
Okay, so today we're going to be looking at more of these fresh bodies of water and more features of them.
The objectives for today's lesson are that you will be able to examine the difference between biotic and abiotic factors of freshwater ecosystems and describe how those factors affect both lentic and lotic ecosystems. You'll also be able to compare and contrast the lentic and lotic freshwater systems in your notes and provide examples of each kind of ecosystem. Lastly, you'll be able to describe how these different ecosystems can support biodiversity, especially during extreme conditions found throughout the 4 seasons.
We're going to look at what we call lentic and lotic ecosystems, and the lentic will just be the still bodies of water and the lotic will be the running bodies of water. And we're also going to look at the ecosystem that they're a part of and how abiotic or non-living and biotic or the living things interact and form that entire ecosystem. So the first type of fresh bodies of water that we're going to talk about are what we covered yesterday, which are streams and rivers. And these are going to be lotic systems because they flow.
Let's take a look at streams and rivers. The water in streams and rivers may flow from melting ice or snow, or the water may come from a spring. A spring is a place where water flows from underground to the Earth's surface. Each stream of water that joins a larger stream is called a tributary. A very strong, wide stream is called a river.
To recap the video you just watched, streams and rivers are examples of lotic ecosystems, meaning the water is freely flowing. Examples of lentic or more stagnant bodies of water include ponds, lakes, marshes, and wetlands.
Ponds and lakes are areas with little water movement. They are not connected to the ocean and are sometimes fed by rivers and streams. Ponds are smaller than lake. However, there is no scientific dimension of a lake or in a pond. Wetlands is an area that is sometimes underwater and whose soil has a great deal of moisture. There are 2 main types of wetlands. A treeless wetland ecosystem is where plants such as grasses grow, is called a marsh. On the other hand, a swamp is a wetland ecosystem in which trees and vines grow and are found within the water.
Okay, so we've looked at the lentic versus the lotic bodies of fresh water. These are going to have factors that we can categorize as the non-living factors, which are the abiotic factors, and the factors that affect the living things in the system, which are the biotic factors.
Biotic factors in ecosystems are items that are considered alive, such as this animal or large tree, or as small as this single-cell euglena or bacteria. In order to be considered biotic, it must have these 6 traits. The organism must be able to grow and develop, be made of cells, respond to stimuli, require energy, be able to reproduce, and finally contain DNA. Abiotic factors are non-living factors in environment. Examples include fire, water, air, ice, sunlight, temperature, and rocks and minerals. In fact, an ecosystem is this interaction between the abiotic and biotic factors in a particular area. Let's take a look at some ecosystems and identify the biotic and abiotic factors. In this ecosystem, the biotic factors are the fish, the trees, and plants. The abiotic factors would include sunlight, sand, clouds, and the water. In this ecosystem, the biotic factors include the human, the trees and plants, and the lichen growing on the rocks. The abiotic factors would include, but not limited to, the rocks, clouds, temperature, and sunlight.
So if we take a look at this picture here, which is a lentic pond, you're going to see that the abiotic factors include things such as sunlight, the soil, the rocks that you can see on the stream bed. Some of the things that are biotic that you can see in this pond include the kingfisher bird, the dragonfly, frogs, and different types of fish, and the plants as well, including the lily pads and the lotus flowers.
So if we look at a Lotic example of this creek here, we're going to identify some abiotic factors like the sand and dirt on the side of the bank. We're going to look at some of the bigger rocks in the middle there. And also you can see that there's going to be some sunlight coming through the canopy. And some of the biotic factors we're going to be looking at are all of the plants you can see around on the bank. You can see some moss on some of the rocks. And it's also going to include things like fish and insects inside this ecosystem. So another abiotic factor that can affect the biotic factors in these ecosystems can be the water level during periods of drought. In the lentic systems, where there are big ponds and lakes, the water level isn't going to change as drastically as it would in the flowing water systems. So the organisms and all of the plants and animals in those systems should be able to survive and have enough space and water to live in those lentic systems. Whereas if you look at the Lotic system of the flowing water, streams and rivers, those organisms are going to have a hard time living when the water starts drying up during a particular dry season or drought in the area. So they're not going to be able to survive as well as the lentic organisms.
In the winter months, water tends to freeze and turn into ice. So in lentic systems, which include things such as ponds, you're going to have a very thin layer of ice at the top. So fish have more room to swim and can go deeper into the water, where it's going to be much warmer at the bottom, and that'll provide some insulation for the fish, and they will be able to survive for long periods of time. However, in Lotic environments such as streams and rivers, they're not going to have as deep of a water to burrow into to find the warmer water, and they're not going to have much room to swim. So that is why larger fish can't survive in these Lotic environments during the winter months.
Okay, so a really important abiotic factor of these two systems is going to be the speed at which the water moves. In each environment, there's going to be fish that are specially adapted in order to live in the more still environment of the lentic systems or the more fast-moving water of the Lotic systems. So an example of this would be like a trout is especially adapted to living in streams and rivers, is where you'll mostly find them as native species. And this is because the streams and rivers are going to have more plant life around, that's going to have more small insects that they like to eat. And if you look at an example of a fish from a lake, like a largemouth bass, these fish are going to want to live deeper down in the water underneath these surface waters, and they're going to be looking for smaller fish and smaller animals like that to eat. So they're more well adapted in these lentic systems. Okay, so this past week or so, we've been tracking the movement of water around the Earth, which is our topic of hydrology. So we've talked about the water cycle of how the precipitation falls on the Earth, and that turns into runoff. Then we talked about how that runoff moves through the Earth, through our watersheds, and how the watersheds funnel all of that water into streams and rivers and lakes and other bodies of water that we've been talking about. And now we're going into more specifics about these bodies of fresh water that the water is funneled into.
Yes, so in today's lesson we took a look at two different types of freshwater bodies, which are lentic and lotic ecosystems. And in these ecosystems, they're both going to possess biotic or living and abiotic, which are non-living characteristics. So we're going to take a look at a lentic ecosystem in the next lesson, which is a wetland.